August 21, 1942. They did not expect a sudden thunder from a short tube to change the meaning of night. A young Japanese soldier crouches in the dark, heart steady with the doctrine he was taught. Seishin, spirit above steel. He trained for silence, for the knife at the throat of an enemy who could be overcome by will. He believed this faith could close the gap where industry failed. In his mind, war is a close thing: touch, blade, breath. Then, in a flash of panic and leaves, a different kind of violence arrives. An up-close blast that scatters men like rain. For those who lost the war, that moment is not only physical, it is a rupture in the story they were told about honor, sacrifice, and reason. This introduction begins with their view because the defeated carry the weight of a history that others have rewritten. The Japanese infantryman did not leave detailed protest notes about shotguns. He tended to write about logistics, artillery, and the rain of steel that overwhelmed him. Yet when American Marines brought trench guns into the jungle, they introduced an instrument that should have overturned the old equation. Close fight, spirit wins. Instead, the truth was messier. The weapon's promise met climate, supply, doctrine, and human error. Paper hulls swelled, orders prioritized rifles. Men who might have relied on shotguns found them jammed in the dark. The result was not a single dramatic turning point, but a slow erosion of possibility, and a mythology that would later grow in the silence left behind. Watch until the end to hear the quiet records, the captured documents, the veterans' shadows, because the real story lives between what was fired and what was kept from the official page. They believed their spirit could close the gap that steel and ships could not. Imagine a young conscript, hair damp from the jungle night, a bayonet sheathed but heavy in his hand, told over and over that the heart must beat louder than the gun. That belief, Seishin, was not a slogan. It was a doctrine shaped by cold arithmetic. Japan produced far less steel than America. Less steel meant fewer guns, fewer tanks, fewer shells. The response was pragmatic and cruel in its beauty. Train the man to be superior where machines fail. Close the distance. Move at night. End the fight by touch. This is how the losing side tried to win. In training camps across the empire, men learned to love the bayonet. They drilled in silence, practiced infiltration under moonlight, rehearsed the intimacy of hand-to-hand combat until the motion felt inevitable. You can see it in their letters and in the photographs that survive. Bright young faces at the edge of the map, eyes steady because their commanders had taught them to be steady. They accepted death as part of discipline. They believed the doctrine would make them better than the weapons that poured over them from the other side of the ocean. But belief and battlefield are different measures. The Pacific Islands turned doctrine into a wager against weather, logistics, and the enemy's resources. The night infiltration attack, move, touch, overwhelm, works against poorly supplied defenders, against soldiers who cannot see you until it is almost too late. It works until the one variable you did not imagine, technology used in an unexpected way, changes the terms of the bet. For those who came from the losing side, this change was not only tactical, it was existential. When a man goes to war convinced that moral force can substitute for iron, and then finds himself facing an instrument that frustrates the ethics of his training, his whole understanding of courage and shame shifts. Listen to the whispered reports from the front. There are accounts of patrols meeting with a blast that did not require careful aim, of wounds that were not the result of duel, but of spread. You do not hear long memoranda protesting the shotgun in the Imperial archives. You hear instead officers and men talking about logistics, guns they did not have, shells they could not replace, and about the overwhelming thunder of naval and air power. This silence is revealing. It is not simple ignorance, it is a record of priorities. When you are overwhelmed by carrier task forces and bombardment, an odd infantry weapon seems less urgent, less worthy of adaptation. Yet for the man who trained to win at close quarters, the idea that a small tube of metal could blunt his tactics would sting like humiliation. These soldiers did not yet know the full map of American production, the factories churning out rifles, shotguns, flamethrowers, and shells. They felt the consequence. In battles like those around Guadalcanal, they met a barrage of things, canister, machine guns, artillery, that turned assault into butchery. They had fought the Chinese and the British, and succeeded sometimes by closing the distance. They had techniques that had worked in Malaya and the Philippines, but in the Pacific, American doctrine and resources arrived with a different scale. For the wounded and the captured, the question was not only what they had done wrong, but what the world had become. There is a small cruelty in the details. Men trained to use their bodies as weapons found themselves stung by a scatter that did not inquire about honor. They learned to rely on night, on silence, on a blade finding the throat. The idea that an enemy would fire a dozen tiny pellets into a tangle of undergrowth, and that such fire required no philosophical justification, only mechanics, made the battle feel absurd. You could be brave and still be helpless. Courage did not translate to survival when ammunition, climate, and supply reoriented the fight. The losers felt the odd, pathetic truth. Virtue is no protection against damp paper shells and cargo manifests. Yet the suffering forged a complex psychology. Where victory had been defined by an ethic, defeat created narratives of blame, of missed opportunity, and of the small technical insults that seemed to mock sacrifice. Veterans would later speak of shame that was not mere personal failure but systemic. They recalled orders that sent them forward into long kill zones, commanders who promised advantageous positions that never existed, supply officers who prioritized other loads. They remembered the sound of the jungle being cut by steel, and the strange new sounds that arrived with the Americans. Some spoke quietly of a noise like a metallic cough that spread terror across a night patrol. Others refused to name the weapon, as if naming it would shorten the list of reasons they had failed. Curiosity should prick here. If men believed their spirit could win, what happens to that belief when the material world contradicts it? Does the soldier change his doctrine, or does he bury the contradiction inside himself? Does the nation revise its training manuals, or does it double down on satiation as a moral defense against industrial reality? The answers are not tidy. Some officers wrote reports that tried to reconcile failure with valor. Others blamed individual cowardice. Many simply accepted loss as fate and continued to train the next group of boys in the same practices. This stubbornness is a human thing, an unwillingness to admit that the matter-of-fact realities of supply and climate made their doctrine hollow in certain places. There are curiosities that help us understand this strained psychology. The Japanese soldiers' letters often mention food, rain, and the way the night smells of rot and salt. They rarely rail about the shotgun. Why? Because the great shocks of war, the carrier fleets, the bombers, the naval guns, left deeper marks and warranted policy responses. Shotguns, in their oddness, were folded into the long list of problems already overwhelming the empire. It is easier, perhaps, to imagine 1,000 machines than to confront the idea that a short, brutal weapon could embarrass your doctrine. But embarrassment matters. For men whose code demanded honor, being surprised by a weapon that did not require an opponent's skill created private fractures. Some turned their embarrassment into a narrative of moral superiority. They preferred to speak of being defeated by weight and industry rather than by shameful weapons. Others kept silence and tried to adapt in the dark, testing new positions and tactics to reduce the shotgun's advantage. In that tension, between adaptation and silence, lies the human story of the losing side. It is not a single failure but 1,000 small reckonings. The moment a man realizes his training will not save him, the bitter calculation of which supplies to hoard, the private grief at knowing your life was gambled on a doctrine that could be outmaneuvered by production and weather. Consider the micro-conflict that recurs in accounts, a unit debating whether to push forward at night. Half the men trust their training. Half have seen enough death to doubt doctrine. Orders press them forward. Wolves of fear and discipline clash. The move begins, hearts thudding. Somewhere a chorus of small noises, a snapped twig, a rustled leaf, becomes meaningful. Is it an enemy? Is it a trap? The logic of satiation says advance. The logic of survival says hold. This is the heartbeat of the losing side's experience, a constant negotiation between the ethics they were taught and the instruments that the other side wields. And here is the deeper human question to carry forward. When you have been taught that the soul can triumph where steel cannot, how do you live with the knowledge that steel and the logistics that feed it have outpaced your doctrine? Do you reforge your beliefs, or do you protect them by telling a different story after the war? Many did both. Some revised tactics quietly, learning from defeats. Many returned to tell commemorative stories that emphasized courage and minimized embarrassing specifics. The memory you inherit, then, is partial, wealthy with emotion, poor in technical detail. Hold that tension. It will lead us to the instrument that tested Saishin in a new way. The battlefield is full of loud contradictions. Doctrine that expects intimacy, enemies that bring range, supplies that fail, and technologies that surprise. In the next phase of this story, a short, blunt weapon, simple enough to be a hunting tool, precise enough to shatter a doctrine, makes an appearance. What did it demand from the men who faced it? How did men trained to step into close violence respond to a new, unromantic form of death? The questions multiply. Stay with them, because in each answer we find not only the mechanics of defeat, but the human cost of a doctrine unable to hold its own in a changing world. They sound like a dozen dry branches snapping at once. That is the first thing the man in the dark remembers. Not a rifle crack, not the slow pulse of a machine gun, but a staccato, brutal noise that seemed to come from nowhere and close the night like a hand. For the Japanese soldier, that sound did not fit his rules of war. It did not ask for skill, it did not respect distance, and it did not care for honor. It scattered men and judgment in equal measure. The trench gun was simple and terrible. In the hands of a Marine, it was a short-barreled 12-gauge pump-action with a heat shield, a bayonet lug, and a habit of making everything close feel immediate. The older Winchester 1897 could slam fire because it lacked a trigger disconnector. Hold the trigger, work the pump, and the gun spat shell after shell. The Model 12 refined many things, safer internals, smoother action, but did not change the basic arithmetic. A single 00 buckshot shell carried 9 heavy pellets. At 10 yards, that spread might be 10 inches. At 20, 20 inches. In dense jungle where sight rarely exceeded 30 yards, the shotgun blurred the need to aim. Spread covered error. It turned lack of skill into lethality. Imagine being trained to close distances at night, to use stealth as armor, and then facing a weapon that ignores those rules. Your doctrine taught that the human body could be sharper than a machine's reach. Now your stealth runs into a ring of tiny bullets that do not require precision and do not wait for honor. The psychological effect was immediate. Fear that your virtues are irrelevant, anger that your training might have been wasted, shame at being felled by a scatter rather than in a blade-to-blade fight. These are feelings soldiers do not advertise, but they shape how a losing side remembers defeat. Think about a time in your own life when a small, unexpected thing changed everything. A sudden message that destroys a relationship. A single medical test that alters a future. A burst of rain that ruins a carefully planned outdoor event. The shotgun in the jungle was like that sudden rain. It did not rewrite all of history by itself, but it made certain choices impossible. It forced people to reevaluate what kept them safe. The emotional landscape of defeat often hinges on these small, sharp remainders. The moments when the habit of the past collides with the surprise of the present. Stories from Japanese patrols capture this collision in human terms. One survivor remembered drifting forward at night with his unit, the jungle a black wall. They moved because their training said, movement, equal advantage. A whisper from the point man, a snap of a leaf, and then a sound like many men coughing at once. The bullets did not seek a single chest, they filled a space. Men fell without the drama their training had promised. Later they would argue about tactics and blame the scatter on luck or on cowardice. But in private, a different conversation took place. How to keep faith in training when the world keeps changing. On the American side, Marines were taught a different kind of practicality. Training manuals showed how to hold a shotgun for clearing a bunker, how to trust spread at short range, how to use the weapon for point security. For them, the shotgun was a tool for a specific job. Seal the immediate danger, stop an ambush, make the jungle unreliable for an attacker. It was not a moral instrument. It was work. That difference in framing, ethics versus tool, produced a gulf between expectations and outcomes that made the weapon psychologically devastating for those who expected battle to be a test of spirit. This is where small human dramas matter. In a platoon, there is always a debate, whether to advance now or wait, whether to trust orders or trust feeling. In many accounts from the islands, you can hear that micro-conflict. Officers educated in doctrine would press forward, mindful of mission and command. Enlisted men, weathered by losses and witnessing new sounds in the dark, would vote with their feet or freeze. That hesitation, that tiny break in rhythm, could mean survival or death. The shotgun amplified those moments because it made every approach a gamble. It forced the leader to recalibrate trust in training against an unpredictable anomaly. You can translate this into everyday choices. When you drive in heavy rain, do you keep the speed, trusting your car and skill, or do you slow down because the world has become unpredictable? We all live with such calibrations. The Japanese soldier's choice at night was the same human calculus in an extremity: proceed with faith in doctrine or deny the map and adapt. Their answers reveal the psychology of a losing side, sometimes stubbornness, sometimes quick learning, often a painful mix of both. Those tiny decisions also influenced how history remembers the shotgun. Public memory prefers a clean cause, a weapon that changed a battle, a tactic that shattered morale. But in reality, change is messy. The shotgun did not win islands by itself. It interacted with machine guns, with naval bombardment, with logistics, and with weather. Yet for the man who expected hand-to-hand justice, it was a symbol of a future that did not honor his ethic. That dissonance shaped post-war memory. Men told stories that preserved honor and sometimes quietly excised the odd humiliations. At this point, you might ask, if the shotgun was so disruptive, why do official records barely mention it from the Japanese side? The answer lies in priority. When an army is losing under the rain of aircraft and artillery, it writes resolutions for those real, measurable threats. File after file contains countermeasures for flamethrowers, for tanks, for naval gunfire. The shotgun, embarrassing and limited by its own logistics, slipped down the list. This bureaucratic silence itself tells a story. Sometimes the things that wound a soldier's pride are not the things that shape strategy. Now consider how small details in our day influence our sense of control. A software update that changes privacy settings without asking. A public policy that alters benefits quietly. These are modern equivalents of the paper-hulled shell that would later become a tragic symbol of missed adaptation. The shotgun itself had no fault if the ammunition swelled in humidity. The failure was organizational, logistic, human. Yet the impact of that failure was felt in the men who stood in the dark and listened to sudden noise. Here is something you can do now to stay with the full story. If you want to follow these voices of the lost, to hear not the triumphalist myths, but the small human fractures of defeat, click the red button in the corner to subscribe. Join a community that chooses the quieter facts, that honors the defeated by telling their full truth. You will get more accounts like this, letters, captured documents, interviews, that bring texture to history. Clicking helps us keep these stories alive, and it means you will not miss the next chapter, where we trace how environment, supply, and bureaucracy stole a weapons promise. Subscribe now and become part of a small group that refuses easy myth and seeks humane clarity. The sound in the dark altered how men made the next move. Some units retooled tactics, pushing scouts differently, changing formations to avoid the shotgun's kill zone. Others held to tradition, valuing doctrine over novelty. This split produced small victories and bitter losses, and it painted the map of defeat with lines of human choice. The emotional work of this period is overlooked if we only talk about steel and numbers. For the losing side, the question was always more intimate. Who are we if our moral code no longer predicts survival? As the night pressed on in those islands, an odd scene repeated itself. Japanese units arguing under the canopy, men comparing wounds and whispering of sound, and American Marines moving with mechanical certainty. Each side carried its own psychology. The victors had faith in production and logistics. The losers had faith in spirit and ritual. The shotgun forced those faiths to meet on the same small, terrible stage. What followed next was not a single, decisive moment, but a slow, wrenching series of adjustments, tactical, emotional, administrative, that would determine how each man and each army remembered the war. The next part of this story will follow the shotgun into the supply chain, where a humble paper hull and the jungle's dampness will turn a tactical promise into a stubborn failure. Stay with that detail. It reveals more about defeat than any victory ever could. A shell that will not fit is a small, cruel betrayal. Imagine a Marine in the humid dark, fingers that have known only the clean click of a well-oiled pump, now finding the chamber tight, a paper hull swollen and stuck, as if it had grown overnight. In that moment, the shotgun, a weapon made to shrink the world into a single, survivable instant, becomes a useless weight. Men trained for midnight violence learn shame quickly when tools fail them. For the Japanese soldier who expected a face-to-face test of spirit, the failing shell was another unpredictable variable in a war already full of them. The problem was simple and mechanical. Commercial shells used paper hulls that absorbed moisture. In the jungles and islands of the Pacific, humidity sits in the air like a physical thing. Paper swelled, crimps loosened or tightened, primers misaligned. A round that slides smoothly home in a dry warehouse could jam in a wet foxhole. The ammunition did not just misfire, it betrayed the logistics that were supposed to make the weapon reliable. For soldiers who trusted equipment as lifelines, the difference between brass and paper was not technical trivia, but a matter of life and death. Technically, the shotgun's promise remained genuine. A 12-gauge 00 buckshot shell carries 9 heavy pellets. At 10 yards, the spread might cover a man-sized area. At 20 yards, it grows, yet still can be lethal, given jungle visibility. The Winchester 1897 slamfire allowed a trained Marine to send 6 shells in quick succession. That raw capacity should have bluntly contested the Japanese doctrine of close infiltration. But capacity means nothing if the supply chain does not protect the ammunition from its enemy, the climate. On March 29, 1945, the military adopted the brass-cased M19 shell, moisture-proof, durable, fit for tropical service. But that date is an uneasy kind of victory. By then, Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima had already been fought. Entire campaigns were won and lost, while paper hulls plagued point men and perimeter guards. The brass solved the technical problem, but far too late to redeem the tactical promise that first ignited imagination and fear on both sides. What does it feel like to know a simple seal on a shell might have altered what happened in a jungle night? Production numbers tell a different story from myth. Winchester made roughly 25,000 Model 1897s and between 60,000 and 80,000 Model 12s for military contracts. Remington, Stevens, and Ithaca added many thousands more. On paper, enough shotguns existed to place them widely across formations. In practice, distribution favored certain roles. Military police, pioneer battalions, guard units, and reserve elements often received shotguns more as tools for control and patrol than as frontline squad weapons. Supply officers prioritized rifles and machine gun belts for obvious reasons. Those weapons fired more rounds for sustained firefights, and their ammunition was lighter and easier to move in bulk. Manufacturing choices compounded the problem. Factories running at American wartime capacity still had to allocate brass for shell casings across many programs. Rifle cartridges, artillery primers, and industrial needs. The decision to continue using paper hulls early on was partly economic and partly logistical. Brass was needed and its allocation was contested. Landing craft and supply ships had limited space. Commanders and logisticians calculated which loads would matter most across entire operations. Shotgun shells often lost that calculation, relegated to the rear or saved for specific missions, rather than distributed liberally to every point man. On Guadalcanal, reports and veteran recollections capture the human edge of this failure. Marines used shotguns for perimeter defense and point security. Photographs show them in the lead during patrols. Yet after-action reports focus on Browning water-cooled machine guns and canister rounds from anti-tank guns as decisive at engagements like the Tenaru. When Marines did try to rely on shotguns, some recounted jamming shells requiring brute force to chamber. That image, a man trying to hammer a stuck shell in the dark, is not just an equipment failure. It is a moral shock. Training, courage, and a simple hammer meet in a half-lit foxhole and produce a scene of bitter impotence. If official enemy records are quiet about shotguns, that is also telling. Japanese captured doctrine and post-war interrogations emphasize machine guns, artillery, and flamethrowers as the real measurable threats. They did not file formal protests about shotguns, as the Germans had after World War I. For a defeated soldier, this silence can feel like erasure. The small humiliation of being surprised by an enemy tool was absorbed into larger narratives of industrial defeat. The men who lived the night adjusted their memories accordingly. Many memoirs omit the shotgun entirely, focusing instead on the overwhelming firepower that shaped entire battles. Why does absence in the archive feel like presence in the mind? Because records are shaped by priorities. Operational research sections produced exhaustive studies on artillery, mortars, and small arms efficiency, yet shotgun employment rarely generated data. Requisition logs overflow with rifle rounds. Shotgun shell orders are sparse, often tied to training. Armorer reports show frequent requests for rifle and machine gun parts, but seldom for shotgun components. These silences become a kind of testimony. The weapon existed and was authorized, but it did not fire often enough to leave statistical footprints. Training manuals did try to integrate shotguns into doctrine. TM 9-285, published in 1942, listed multiple models and recommended roles: point security, night defense, bunker clearing, and prisoner control. Marines trained at Camp Pendleton and elsewhere practiced slam fire and room clearing techniques. Yet instructors warned against over-reliance. Slam fire consumed ammunition fast and heated barrels dangerously. Training assumed reliable ammo and controlled conditions. The jungle assumed neither, creating a gap between rehearsal and reality. Now imagine adapting in the field with limited shells and unreliable hulls. Units in New Guinea found paper cases even worse there. Constant rain, river crossings, and persistent humidity rendered shells nearly unusable. Some units requested shotguns based on Guadalcanal experiences, but left them in rear areas rather than carry extra weight for an uncertain advantage. In Iwo Jima, volcanic ash fouled mechanisms. In Manila, thick urban defenses denied close approaches. Each environment mapped a new constraint, revealing that a weapon's value depends on supply, terrain, and doctrine converging, a rare alignment in war. How do you hold a tactical promise when climate, production, and priority all conspire against it? The human consequences reach beyond tactical charts. For a Japanese soldier, facing an enemy whose tools sometimes worked and sometimes failed presents a strange mercy and an added humiliation. Victory and defeat are rarely pure. Men adjusted tactics, some learning to avoid approaches where shotguns could dominate, others double-guessing their night attacks. The American side grew frustrated too. A weapon conceived for jungle terror became awkward when its ammunition betrayed it. The late arrival of the brass M19 offered a bureaucratic solution, but it could not undo the nights in which a man's life depended on an imperfect shell. This is where history feels both intimate and unfinished. The shotgun story is not heroic or decisive in the grander arithmetic of the Pacific War. It is a study in how small material details, paper versus brass, hulls that swell, priorities in a supply depot, alter human plans and perceptions. For the losing side, those details compounded a larger fate, the realization that courage and doctrine alone might not navigate the industrial reality closing around them. We will follow those paper trails, those missing entries, and the quiet personal reckonings that they produced. What we find there is not a single answer, but a series of small failures and adaptations that reveal the human cost of logistic choices and climatic realities. They kept careful lists. Tons of steel, ships launched, rounds produced, men landed. In those columns, the shotgun is a small item, easy to lose in the arithmetic of industrial warfare. Yet for a man under tropical leaves, it could be an enormous presence or an embarrassing absence. The losers watched those lists too, and they understood that they fought not simply against rifles, but against an economy that could turn a tool into a tide. Japan's wartime economy could not match American industry. As many wartime observers put it, Japan produced less steel in a year than the United States did in a month. That Gulf-shaped doctrine, Seishin, night infiltration, bayonet work, it also shaped how small technical details, like a paper shell or a brass case, could have outsized consequences. The archive shows where priorities lay. Operational research records overflow with studies on artillery, mortars, Browning guns, and flamethrowers. The flamethrower, for instance, appears repeatedly in the files. At Iwo Jima, Marines used something like 27,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel to clear caves and tunnels. Records of ammunition expenditure in rifle rounds and machine gun belts are exhaustive. By contrast, shotgun ammunition requisitions are modest and sporadic. Repaired shotgun parts are rare in armorer logs. These silences are not proof that shotguns never fired, but they do argue a point. Shotguns did not consume the kind of material attention that would make them central to operational planning. For the Japanese soldier who lost, these papers read like a rationalization. It was easier after a war to sign reports about artillery and carriers than to name the humiliation of being surprised by a scatter of pellets at close range. Captured Japanese operational manuals and interrogation records contain long, painful analyses of countering artillery, of building reverse slopes and spider holes against tanks, of adjusting anti-aircraft posture. There are whole sections on how to defend against flamethrowers. There is virtually nothing devoted to shotguns. That absence is itself an answer. The defeated army concentrated on weapons they saw as decisive. They did not see the shotgun as that kind of weapon, even if, in some moments, it mattered terribly to individual men. The human record amplifies the same theme. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project holds thousands of Pacific War interviews. The National Museum of the Pacific War keeps over 4,000 oral histories. In those collections, shotgun accounts are rare. Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed, one of the most detailed memoirs, does not discuss shotguns. Robert Leckey's Helmet for My Pillow is similarly silent. Why? Because the daily grind of combat, mortars, rifle fire, artillery, starvation, disease, filled memory and time. If your life tilts on whether you have food and heavy weapons support, a specialized close-range arm becomes a detail that fits into a later, quieter shelf. Yet, small details can hurt more than large ones. Consider the paper-hulled shell. In humid jungles, paper absorbs moisture, swells, and can lock in the chamber. Accounts describe shells so swollen that Marines tried to force them with tools. The image is blunt. A man in the black of a jungle trained to clutch a tool for life, forced into hammering a shell because humidity had turned manufacture into a trap. On March 29, 1945, the military adopted the brass-cased M19, a moisture-proof solution. But that adoption came late. Iwo Jima had been fought. Okinawa loomed. The brass fixed the technical problem, but could not retroactively free the nights when a dependable shell might have altered an outcome, or at least a feeling of safety. Logistics explain part of this lag. A 12-gauge shell weighs roughly twice a rifle cartridge and occupies more space. A Marine could carry many more rifle rounds than shotgun shells in the same weight and volume. Supply officers and ship manifest planners made granular decisions. What cargo will most likely keep a division fighting for days, weeks, months? Rifle cartridges, machine gun belts, mortar rounds won those debates. Brass itself was a contested material during wartime. Factories prioritized shell casings for high-volume munitions. The result? Paper hulls for shotgun shells remained. In service on tropical fronts despite their clear vulnerability. The battlefield disciplines reflected these choices. Marine tables of organization authorized around 306 shotguns per division, intended for military police, pioneer battalions, and selected rifle squads. On paper, every division had them. In practice, the weapons were often assigned to rear roles: guard duty, prisoner control, shipboard security. Many shotguns spent more time in arms rooms than in combat. Administration logs show frequent requests for rifle parts and belts, steady records of bar wear and tear. Shotgun maintenance is sparse. This mismatch between authorization and employment tells a larger story about how armies actually use what they have versus how they say they will use it. Where shotguns did appear in combat, the contexts are revealing. In Guadalcanal, some Marines used them for perimeter defense and as pointmen tools on patrol. Photographs show shotguns in the grip of pointmen leading through tangled tracks. At Tenaru River, the slaughter of Colonel Ichiki's detachment is often attributed to Browning water-cooled machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister. Shotguns are mentioned only in passing. In New Guinea, humidity and river crossings only worsened ammunition reliability, and many units relegated shotguns to rear areas rather than carry them into weight-starved patrols. In Manila and other urban fights, shotguns might have helped in close quarters, but Japanese defenders quickly adapted by barricading, creating kill zones, and denying the short approach a shotgun needed to be most effective. In Iwo Jima, volcanic ash and fortified caves blunted shotgun employment. Flamethrowers and demolition charges carried the day in clearing positions. By Okinawa, brass ammunition finally arrived in numbers, but the landscape of the battle, fortifications, depth defenses, and an avoidance of mass banzai charges left little room for the shotgun to change the calculus. This pattern matters because it reveals how myth grows. Popular culture loves a clean symbol. The image of a Marine with a trench gun sweeping a bunker makes for powerful film and game scenes. Stories compress and dramatize. They prefer a single tool that stands for cunning or brutality. The shotgun has those visual properties, up close, visceral, intimate. But history is often messier. Weapons that actually determined Pacific outcomes were those that integrated into doctrine and logistics at scale. Naval gunfire, carrier aviation, mass-produced artillery, flamethrowers, and coordinated combined arms. These are the systems that overwhelmed Japanese defenses and forced strategic collapse. Still, cultural memory is not innocent. After the war, American films, pulp accounts, and later video games embraced the shotgun as a symbol of improvisation and ferocity. The image served narratives of American ingenuity, a hunting weapon repurposed to defeat an honor culture opponent. For the losers, such stories can feel like a double injury. Not only did they lose territory and lives, they became props in a story that simplified their experience. Japanese survivors returned to a country devastated and occupied. Their testimonies often had to compete with foreign narratives that favored dramatic spectacle over nuance. That tension leads to moral questions that resist easy answers. Who owns victory narratives? How should a nation remember a war that it mostly lost? For veterans who survived, memory involves negotiation, preserving dignity, explaining failure, and sometimes erasing moments of humiliation. The shotgun's sparse presence in Japanese accounts may be a deliberate choice. It is easier to catalogue the systemic failures of industry and logistics than to dwell on the indignity of being surprised by a weapon that required no individual honor to use. Moreover, when so much else was failing, supply lines, strategic options, home front industry, a specialized infantry oddity seemed less worthy of strategic recalibration. Yet the human record keeps small truths. Veterans who recall night patrols speak of a sound that rushed through undergrowth and reshaped decisions. They speak of micro-conflicts in squads, debating whether to move, to wait, to press an attack, and how the presence or absence of certain tools affected those choices. They remember being forced to adapt, to reorder priorities, to accept that doctrine is sometimes a romantic lie against the hard arithmetic of logistics. After the war, militaries studied what mattered. The Army's infantry board prioritized rifles, machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles for development. Shotguns received minimal attention. Korea and Vietnam would reuse shotguns in niches, tunnel clearing, breaching, close patrols, but never as a main arm of infantry squads. That choice reflects a simple truth revealed in the Pacific. A weapon's value depends not only on its design, but on supply, doctrine, terrain, and timing. The shotgun story is a lesson in integration. Still, the myth persists, because myth simplifies complexity into an image easy to hold, and because images demand emotional companions. For Americans, the trench gun fits a story of pragmatism when faced with a problem. Americans made and shipped something useful. For Japanese survivors, that image reads differently. It can feel like a reductive claim that minimizes their tactical thought, their adaptations, and their suffering. Their silence about the shotgun in official records is less an omission than a choice. When forced to make meaning from defeat, they emphasized forces they could measure, name, and oppose. As we read these records, we must ask a question that echoes back to the men under the trees. What do we owe the losers of a war when we tell its story? Do we cleanly select icons and make sense for ourselves, or do we listen to the small, embarrassing failures that complicate victory narratives? The shotgun, with its late brass shells and paper follies, pushes us toward the hard answer. History must keep the small details. The dry statistics, production numbers, gallons of fuel, authorized weapons matter not because they absolve anyone, but because they show how decisions at desks and docks touch lives under leaves. If we keep those small facts, We respect not only winners, but those whose lives were rearranged in ways that no single cinematic scene can capture. The last decisive thing in that theater was not a single weapon, but a ledger, a manifest of ships, a list of barrels of oil, a tally of brass casings stamped and sent. That ledger decided more lives than any bayonet or trench gun. For the men who stood under the leaves and believed Seishin, that spirit could compensate for steel, the ledger reads like a final, impersonal verdict. It says, production, supply, and timing matter. They matter more than myth, more than cinematic images of one tool turning the tide. This is not to deny heroism. It is to move beyond simple stories so we can hold deeper truths. The shotgun, the trench gun with its brutal close-range promise, is a useful symbol for that lesson. It was present in hundreds of thousands of pieces, authorized on tables of organization and carried in photographs. Yet its real story is small and precise. Paper shells swollen by humidity, a brass solution adopted on March 29, 1945, that arrived too late for Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, and a supply chain that preferred rifle rounds and machine gun belts because those consumables kept units fighting day after day. The weapon could intimidate on film. In practice, it was often a rear area tool, a guard's weapon, a specialist's instrument. Its myth exceeds its measured impact. Now imagine you are on the losing side. You were trained to enter the enemy's world at close range. You practiced to use your body and courage to close space and end a fight with a blade. Your doctrine promised meaning. If the material world lacked sufficient weapons, your spirit would supply the difference. Then you face not only overwhelming naval and air power, but also a small, unromantic instrument that upsets your assumptions. Worse, when that instrument fails because of paper hulls in the rain, you confront not just an enemy, but a logistic system that humiliated you by neglect. How do you hold your honor then? How do you tell your sons and your nation about bravery when the facts smell of rust and mold? That question frames the loser's experience after the war. Many Japanese veterans and civilians carried memories of bombardment, hunger, and loss. They met occupying forces and re-envisioned their national identity through defeat and reconstruction. Their official records and interrogations often focus on the larger mechanisms that destroyed their armies: carrier aviation, overwhelming industrial output, coordinated combined arms. They wrote manuals about countering flamethrowers and tank threats. They did not file formal complaints about American shotguns, but absence in paper does not mean absence in the heart. Silence sometimes shelters shame. Sometimes it preserves dignity. Sometimes it is a practical choice. When entire supply lines break, a specialized weapon is less worthy of strategic note. We must admit something uncomfortable. The culture of memory chooses what to magnify and what to forget. For the victors, images of Marines with trench guns became a compelling shorthand for improvisation and grit. For the defeated, the same image could read as a trivialization of their suffering. Film and fiction love dramatic scenes. They prefer clean causes. Real wars are complicated. They are lived in the micro-decisions of squads, in manifest lists, in the random dampness of a jungle night that swells paper into a death trap. These small facts do not make for easy storytelling, but they are more honest. If we care about truth and compassion, we must turn toward those small facts and toward the losers who carry their own private histories. Think of the veteran who returns home to rebuild a ruined city, whose family is hungry, who must weave a life from fragments. He does not always want to narrate the technical details of how his unit was outgunned. He wants to keep dignity for himself and his comrades. But dignity and truth can coexist. To honor someone's courage does not require us to sanitize the cause of their defeat. We can both lament the bravery of Seishin and recognize the bitter arithmetic of supply and industry that made that bravery insufficient. There is another moral in this. Technology alone does not decide outcomes unless it is sustained by doctrine, logistics, and timing. A tool without a supply chain is a weight. A doctrine without resources is a moral position vulnerable to material reality. The shotgun story shows that innovation must be integrated into plans and logistics to matter. It also shows that culture will amplify certain images because they fit a narrative we want to believe. If we let that selective memory stand unchallenged, we impoverish our understanding of history and we fail the men whose lives were shaped by both myth and manifest. We should also learn humility. The defeated are not merely data points. They are people who loved their homes, who held children, who wrote letters in the rain. When we recount battles, when we analyze strategies, when we choose symbols, remember that behind each ledger entry is a human life rearranged. The Japanese soldier who learned to fight with a blade did so because his nation placed a moral value on courage in a specific historical situation. He deserves study and empathy, not only to understand his failures, but to grasp the human cost of strategic choices made far from his foxhole. This leads to a simple ethical question. How do we remember war fairly? We begin by resisting seductive simplifications. We read manifest lists and also read letters. We watch films, but also consult supply logs. We honor valor, but also examine the chain of command and the docks where materials were loaded. We listen to losers because their memories challenge the narratives of winners and reveal subtler truths. Their silence in archives might be protective, but our mission should be to recover those quiet voices when possible and to treat them with respect. I ask you now to take that mission with me. If this story has moved you, if it has unsettled a comfortable image or offered a new lens on courage and defeat, join the conversation. Subscribe to the channel to follow more careful, compassionate histories that center human experience, not only dramatic spectacle. Like this video if you value nuance over myth. Comment below with your questions, memories, or family stories, anonymously if you prefer. Share a memory of a relative who served, or a document you have seen, or a feeling this episode stirred. Your voice matters. It helps us build a fuller record. We cannot change what the ledger recorded. We can, however, choose how we remember it. Choose curiosity that honors complexity. Choose empathy that examines detail. Choose to listen to the losers as well as the victors. Because only by doing so do we get closer to the truth of what happened. Click subscribe, like, and share your thoughts. The past is loud, but it is also fragile. Help keep it honest.